where do you want me to look for the interview? I always get like really distracted. I'm one of these people who never knows where to look when we're taking a selfie, and always like.
Right, so I'm just going to tell you.
Do you want me to look there to the camera or at you?
Yeah, well, you can look at the camera there, or you can look at me on the screen. Just change it around. That's what I do. Welcome back, Croeso nôl, to the channel. Thanks again for watching. Special guest today, the third guest in what's turning out to be a wee little lockdown series on Welsh creatives. We have Mrs. Fflur Dafydd. Fflur, hello again.
Hiya.
So, what's happening? You all right?
Well, not much at the moment. So I'm in my eldest daughter's bedroom, which is the only place in the house left, really, for me to go. I'm running out of spaces to hide. So we might have some kids barging in the middle of this, but, you know, I guess anything goes because it's lockdown TV, so.
We're in, aren't we? There's just so much flexibility at the moment. We're in for yeah. Okay, fabulous. Well, I'm going to briefly introduce you to people who are watching, because although I'm sure that a lot of people who watch this will be aware of you or fans, I like to think that hopefully some people who haven't previously heard of you will come to view this YouTube video too. So I'm not sure, I'm going to ask you actually, Fflur, how you define yourself in a minute, but Fflur is one of those annoyingly multi-talented creatives. So you're a novelist, screenwriter, singer-songwriter, producer now too, and mother. Anything else?
I'm baking a lot at the moment.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always taste nice.
Okay.
But I put in the effort.
Sure. Oh, well, I'm sure you can make a good job of mastering that. But I'm going to ask you questions starting off. So I discovered you because of my obsession and fascination with all things Wales. I started off watching a film that you wrote and produced, but I'm going to ask you about your early life. Where are you from? Where are you born? I don't even know that.
I was born in Carmarthen, but grew up in Ceredigion in a small village called Penwllan, near Llandysul. Very rural area, small village, you know, lots of like roaming around the fields and visiting people's farms, and kind of plenty of space to play. And yeah, it's just a lovely sort of close-knit community. And
so you're typical Wales on screen, really.
Yeah, it was, but we didn't live on a farm, so it wasn't that kind of archetypal kind of farming background. So it was kind of different because it was a Welsh village, Welsh speaking, but you also had English speakers in the village as well. So it was a kind of a curious mix of those influences, and it was a sort of busy childhood. There was lots going on in the family life, but both my parents were Welsh language activists. My father was quite a prominent figure in the Welsh Language Society, end of the 70s, start of the 80s. And he was actually imprisoned when I was a baby for his role in the campaign for a Welsh language television channel. So that was very much bound up in our history. We were, even though we lived in rural West Wales, we were often travelling to Cardiff to go on marches and go to protests and meetings, and so, you know, you had on the one hand the sort of the small close-knit community, the traditional Welsh upbringing, but you also had the sort of very political, active kind of bustle at the same time. So it was yeah, the language is kind of all around us in really different ways.
That's fascinating to hear, because I've just been reading about Paul Turner this week, the director of Hedd Wyn, who was blacklisted by the BBC for a long time as a director because of suspected, you know, militancy with the Communist Party and suspected involvement with Cymdeithas in the occupying of the BBC studios. But how times have changed. I wonder how times have changed, because I didn't know that about your dad, so that could probably take you onto a whole other podcast, to be honest, of questions about that. So you got that.
Yeah, it's interesting because of his kind of trajectory, really, because he he'd come from that sort of radical background, but in his career then in sort of rural and economic development ended up as a senior civil servant for the Welsh government. So you can kind of have that background but still end up kind of working within the establishment and sort of moving in both ways, really. So yeah, they probably didn't do a lot of background checks on him, I gather. But he's perfectly safe.
What a country we live in. So how are you aware of this growing up as a child? Is it something that's very much a backdrop, or is it a building block of your creativity? What do you reckon?
It's interesting when I think about it now, because even though all that was going on, and you know, my mum was very active as well, and she's a Welsh language poet, Menna Elfyn, and so she was sort of a prominent kind of literary figure, but also involved with campaigns. And she was sort of protesting kind of later on into my sort of teenage years, and I kind of remember being a bit of a stroppy teenager about that when she came back from some protest in Cardiff and she'd been arrested for spray painting a telephone box, and I was a bit like, oh God, you know, there's a police car outside, this again. Which is really silly, kind of brilliant. Typical teenager, you know, really. But I think what I thought a lot about this, so I think what they did during those times and what all the people who were involved in Welsh Language Society campaigns did was that they fought those battles for my generation. So my brother and I grew up not exactly taking the language for granted, but it was like so instilled in us. We were allowed to have a Welsh medium education. We didn't have to have the same attitudes towards English that they had, because they were often denied it in their school years. They had to fight for it. They were often not allowed to even speak Welsh in some classes, and we avoided all that. So we were able to engage with it in a different way. So I wouldn't have said that I grew up as politically charged as they did, because I wasn't having to fight those battles. But it's certainly now wonderful for me writing for S4C, knowing, you know, the part that my dad played in that. And it's certainly there kind of subconsciously, but I wouldn't say I was as kind of active as they were. You know, I'd like to be, but it's just a different time now, and the kind of, I guess, colonization and things like that are more difficult to detect, or it's more complex. It's not, you know, taking down signs or spray painting, or, you know, it's not the visible kind of thing that it was. So it's perhaps a more difficult battle to fight. And I like to think that I'm doing it through my writing, I guess.
I mean, in my part of the world, it's not visible at all in that period. I mean, we're roughly the same age, 78, I think. I think you're a few months before me. But in my part of the world, Vale of Glamorgan, 1980s, 1990s, that is not visible at all. We are hidden from that world. I think I was one of the 6 kids in my junior school who was taken to Llangrannog in 89, which what I didn't know then, but it was the Urdd, but I didn't know that then. I just thought I was going to some quirky Welsh language camp. And that was the first year that I was even aware of Cymraeg, when there was quite a big push to have it in our junior schools just for 1 hour a week. And before 1989, when I was 10 and a half, I wasn't aware of the Welsh language, and I certainly wasn't aware of any of the events you're talking about until I was 20, 22. So this is kind of invisible from my part of the world, which kind of forms part of my fascination, I suppose, with it when discovering that it all happened. You were talking about the different attitudes of your parents' generation because of the relationship between the two languages was very different then, whereas perhaps it's a bit more melded now, particularly in terms of the drama and creativity. I was speaking to Philip John last week, who has done such a good job with Bang in the natural way he presented the two languages there. And do you regard yourself as primarily a Welsh language artist? Is that like in your bio, do you think?
I think that I always had the notion that I would want to publish in Welsh first, and that I wanted to write things in Welsh first and foremost. But, you know, for me growing up, like I said, because the Welsh language is all around me, there's kind of this exotic allure of the English language. It was like this new exciting thing. And when I really sort of fell in love with English language literature in sixth form, and then I went on to do an English literature degree at Aberystwyth. And I was living in Welsh-speaking halls, and I was kind of like the odd one out because hardly anybody was doing English in a Welsh-speaking hall. And I always felt that there was something about the other that I wanted to discover. And I went on to, do an MA and a PhD, and then I wanted to get into kind of academia and ended up teaching creative writing through the medium of English. And that's when I really started thinking about publishing works in English at the same time. And so I think that they kind of coexist in my life by now. For several years, maybe a decade, when I was working at Swansea University, English was the language of kind of academia, as a more sort of clear, precise language that I could say different things in. Welsh was more sort of emotional. There was more room to experiment with it. And I think certainly now I find in screenwriting that they can actually coexist. They can coexist on the page. So when I'm writing scripts for things like Tri Pump Diwrnod and Tri Pump Awr, I tend to write the scene directions in English now because I know they're going out to a crew. Not all of them will speak Welsh anyway. And then, especially with Tri Pump Awr, you noted it in your review as a bilingual drama. But I hadn't actually thought about it in those terms. But, I did have a character. Yeah, that's why I was saying that if you had 12 jury members from Welsh-speaking Wales, they wouldn't all speak Welsh in the same way. And that's what's wonderful about Wales, I think, is it's so diverse. Some people will have a sort of a purer, more formal Welsh. Some people will dip in and out between the English language and the Welsh language, and they'll do that quite effortlessly, and they're not making a point. They're just kind of code switching. And I've noticed it sometimes when Welsh learners are talking to people who dip in and out of English and Welsh, that they tend to they'll switch the entire conversation to English, thinking, oh, this person is now speaking in English. And then they'll realise, oh no, they've gone back into Welsh. It's quite disorientating if you're outside that experience. But that's totally normal and realistic. So I think that I've had a bit more freedom, I would say, in screenwriting to let them sort of coexist, because you can't do that with a novel. I mean, I did try with 20,000 Saints, which is a novel about a group of people coming together on Bardsey Island, and there's one character who's rediscovering his Welsh, and I did have the odd sentence here and there in Welsh, but you've got to kind of pick up on it or qualify it or in some way interpret it on the page, so it doesn't quite sit as easily as it would on screen, really. So but you notice in Scandi dramas, I've been watching a lot of those recently, and there'll be like phrases or entire sentences, and no one says that about Scandi drama. So I think Welsh drama should be the same, really.
It is a way in. It is a way in. Like I mean, in many ways, I wish it wasn't the case with me, but it definitely is a way in. It just gives you that occasional bit of grounding as a monoglot.
Yeah, and it also, I guess, depends on the kind of drama that you're writing. So my first series, Parch, was set in a small village in West Wales, and there wasn't any English in that, apart from the character who is Estonian who comes in, and that was their reality as well. So I think it also depends on the kind of reality that you're trying to depict.
What can the viewers expect from Tri Pump Diwrnod? Started on Sunday, and episode 2 is on this Sunday, 9 p.m. You catch them, so you can catch the episodes on the S4C player click, also on iPlayer 2, I believe. Yeah. So what can viewers expect if they want to tune in? Well, if they want to go on the iPlayer and watch episode 1, and in preparation for Sunday's app, what can they do?
It's a really interesting one, this, I think, because it is still very much a whodunit. You see the body at the beginning, and we go back 35 days to find out how it all happened. But at the same time, it's very much a kind of a more conventional drama about a group of women, group of friends, the secrets they're keeping from one another, secrets that go back years. And I think that actually the intensity and that kind of thriller element also comes from their individual stories. So I'm hoping that what you're going to get is that you're going to be wanting to know every step of the way what's happened to these girls and what the mystery is. And by the time you get to the final episode, you'll be like, oh, and I remember now, there's also like a body, so that it doesn't have to be all about trying to work out which one of them, you know, killed which one at the beginning. It's more that you'll be interested in the individual stories as mini thrillers. Lots of mini thrillers in this, I think.
Do you feel that because of the way modern TV is, the non-episodic modern TV, writing cliffhangers, which, I mean, didn't used to be TV back in the day. It was only really Doctor Who, I think, you got these regular cliffhangers, which of course was nowhere near as dramatic as the modern TV. It was quite farcical. But how do you find writing cliffhangers? Because I watched, and I still get surprised by cliffhangers. I should be expecting them by now, but I watched episode 2 before it's gone out. I've seen episode 2. And I was just kind of, just winding down towards the end of the episode. And then I had a big moment when I just went back and like this. Shit, like, maybe I should have been expecting that by now. But I don't know, maybe it's the writing. But so how do you feel about writing cliffhangers and that subversion that you're talking about just now?
Yeah, I live for those moments because I remember sort of being in the cinema watching a Llyfrgell with an audience. There's that moment where she thinks that Dan is dead, and then he sort of comes back up with the knife. And when you see people jumping, you're like, yes, it's exactly that element of surprise that kind of makes it all worthwhile, because you sort of lull them into a false sense of security, like you say, winding down end of episode, and then throw something big at them. And well, I mean, we worked really, really hard on our cliffhangers, I must say that, because Paul Jones, the producer, he'll insist on a cliffhanger for every end of part, and because we write for an end of part with S4C, so the ad break, so it's continuously having to come up with new ways of keeping the audience intrigued, which I think you wouldn't have in an hour-long drama on BBC. So I think that's a really, really good skill to be able to hone over a period of time. But yeah, I was really pleased with that end of episode 2. It's far scarier, I think, that it actually I'd written it on the page. It was, but I think it was necessarily scary for it to be a really good cliffhanger. So yeah, they're tricky things though. But it drives me up the wall when you watch a drama that has a end of part that's just someone like making a cup of tea or just saying something completely bland, walking out of a room. It's like, that's not cliffhanger. You have to. It's a crime if you don't even leave anything behind in an end of part. So again, that's kind of become part of my method.
I mean, fundamentally, all I want to see when I'm watching a TV or film is I just want to know if I want to know what's going to happen next, then I think that the writer and the director and the team's done its job. If the audience wants to see what happens to these people, and if anything I'm watching when I feel that, then I know I'm in. It's that moment where you realise that I want to see what's going on. I've seen the first 2 apps. Am I allowed to say that? I've seen the first. Yeah, I've seen the first 2 apps. So, and this has brought me into, so it's helped me. 35 diwrnod?
Diwrnod.
Diwrnod.
Yeah, some people say diwrnod, some people say diwrnod.
So this is actually the 5th series of this, is it not? Or the 4th?
Yes, I only came on board for the last series. So the first 3 were written by other people. But
so you came on board by virtue of the success of 35 Awr, yeah?
Yes, so I'd worked, it's the same company who made Parch, my first series. So my third and final series of Parch came to an end, and then they offered me the opportunity to write 35 Awr. But I should say that both those series, they've kind of, the brand kind of belongs to the company and the former writers, and the company provided me with the brief of the idea. So Rhys Powys came up with the idea for 35 Awr, and Rachel Evans came up with the idea for 35 diwrnod. So it's slightly different to being kind of a creator writer on the show. You're given a notion of what the story should be. You get the treatment in the Bible that they produced, but I don't tend to follow that. and they don't tend to force me to follow that either, which is great. So, for example, with Trydydd Pump Awr, you know, Rhys Powys comes up with this idea of a man on fire at the beginning, and then I ask him, so how does that happen? What's the conclusion? He's like, well, that's your job to find that out. So I spend the entire period of writing building up to this moment, not actually knowing how I'm going to do it, which I think is kind of thrilling and risky, really risky as well. And it was the same with Trydydd Pump Diwrnod. So Rachel Evans came up with this idea of a group of girls, you know, getting married, and there was going to be a hen party, and one of them was going to die at the beginning. But again, it was so open-ended. No one knew how it had happened or what the interactions were between the characters. So they then give me complete freedom in these storyline sessions, which I work with Paul Jones, the producer, on, and Rachel Evans as well, because it was her original idea. But they give me a lot of liberty to go off on different tangents and stuff, which is nice. Because I don't think I could work with, if I was given a complete like Bible, this is it, done and dusted, write that, I'd find it very difficult to make it work, really.
Do you ever find yourself like getting stressed while doing this and going off in directions which you then got to, you know, go back on? Do you ever find it a stressful process writing these things with so many characters too?
Oh gosh, yeah, it's always a stressful process. It's complete hell writing this. The last one was terrible process to write. It's only when you get to the end you're like, oh, I really enjoyed that. But when you're in it, it's really tricky, and we work in quite like a feral way, so that, you know, I write episode by episode, and then if I decide to change something, then we haven't sort of tied ourselves up in knots with preparing too much for the end, if you see what I mean. So there are all sorts of episodes where there'll always be one episode where I'll go, oh my God, this is a disaster, this is going to be terrible, this is just not going to work, it's the worst thing I've ever done. And then 2 episodes later I'm like, no, it's fine now. You know, I think if you ask the producer, he'd say the same thing. I think we both reach like some point where we're like, oh, is this actually going to work? And then once it's all done and dusted and we've seen the final edits of every episode, we're like, oh, it's good, it's a good one, we're happy then. But it takes you ages to get to the point where you feel like it's okay, and then you still think on the night it goes out, what if we're completely wrong, what if it is shit, you know? So
how
it's
are you feeling last year when Trydydd Pump Awr goes out? January last year started. How you, and also for Park as well, how are you feeling when you're getting the initial reactions to that? Because also 35-hour Trydydd Pump Awr was very well marketed.
Yeah,
I was
it
seeing these graphic images on buses and on things like this, and I never really remember seeing that before round here. But so how did you feel when you were getting the feedback and when audience reacted to your first 2 series?
I was a bit nervous, I think, with Trydydd Pump Awr, because people knew me as the kind of writer of Parch, and Parch had a very solid sort of following, and a certain type of following as well. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily, if you like Parch, you may also like Trydydd Pump Awr. I think it was actually a slightly different audience, that maybe the people who really like Parch might have turned off because it was, you know, I don't know, quite it's quite violent actually, Trydydd Pump Awr, and quite crazy, but at the same time it felt like being unleashed. I wasn't even allowed to swear on Parch, and then I think I maybe went a bit overboard with Trydydd Pump Awr, and I'm always nervous like the first time it goes out. With Trydydd Pump Diwrnod I was a bit more relaxed because several people had seen it beforehand, and I thought it would be an easier first episode to access than Trydydd Pump Awr, which is, you know, the jury in a room, they're all talking. That was a pretty intense first episode, and I think you either love it or hate it. I think with Trydydd Pump Diwrnod, maybe younger audiences would tune into it, and it's more accessible, more intercutting, more kind of other stories to keep you interested. So I was happier, I think, with that first episode would go down okay. You know, I do check Twitter and stuff afterwards, but I'll never look at it when the program's on. I'll just be sort of like
So do you watch them when they go out, when they broadcast?
Yeah, and I try to watch it like a first time viewer. I'm trying to guess what they're thinking, what they're trying to work out, which is something I also applied to the writing process. You always think, what will they think now is happening in this scene, and can I subvert it and make them think something else? So,
you talk about the violence and the dramatic things happening. I mean, surely that's an essential for taking it away from what we were talking about previously. I mean, a certain element of magical realism. I mean, how many TV shows, films do you know that are genuinely true to life? I mean, I don't know many, and I'm not a huge fan of many products that are like that. So, I mean, sure, don't you think that having these dramatic things happen to your characters that may seem a little bit far-fetched, shall we say, is kind of an essential for reaching a bigger, wider audience?
Oh, definitely. I think, I'm very big on plot, and, I think that you've got to have shocking moments in TV. You've got to have like water cooler moments. And it's as long as it's not like gratuitous violence, as long as it's not like you're just throwing in a violent scene because you can't think of anything else to do. That's the kind of my number one rule in a way. So it's, it always has to have like a purpose, and it also has to be sort of bound with the plot, that it's actually part of like that character's journey or whatever. So yeah, and it was, kind of exciting to go from something like Parch, which is more kind of it was more like a 6 Feet Under type kind of, it was a bit of a family saga as well as being like a black sort of dark comedy, a bit surreal as well, but then going into like fast-paced kind of violent drama. And I think hopefully just being able to show that the breadth of the work, and that I won't just be sticking to one kind of particular Welsh story. It's kind of like I'm interested in all of them, all the voices and all the variations, really. Yeah.
So talking about Fflur, so you wrote that, the book. By the way, although we've never met, which it feels like we have, but we haven't, I do have a signed copy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Did you find it in a charity shop?
Found it in a charity shop.
Oh, that ungrateful person. I hope it's not signed to anybody.
I know. I could drop them right in it here. I didn't think about that aspect. But anyway, yeah, so I've got a signed copy. There you go. So you wrote it with turning it into, by the way, I'm really pedantic. I say movie because I'm pedantic with words. And if it's not shot on film, I don't like saying film. So you wrote the novel with an idea of turning it into a movie, right?
Yes, because I'd done this sort of, I had a very brief period of being a kids TV presenter, most unsuccessful. I did this educational program, and one of the items, I'll send you the link to this, because I've started popping up again as a result of the coronavirus on like BBC bite-size educational snippets, and there's a little film of me going around the National Library when I was in my early 20s, talking about the White Book of Fflur, which is actually in the film, and that's the first time that I'd ever been given access to those corridors and those archives in the library, because I'd been to Aberystwyth as a student, I loved the building, but then I was like, wow, there's this whole other world that I didn't know about, and I think at that time I'd already made a film with Lynn, and I remember thinking, wouldn't it be amazing to make a movie about the National Library directed by Lynn? That was like a passing thought in early 2000s, and then it sort of niggled away, and then I remember a friend of mine saying, I never get the budget to do something like that. So I thought, well, I'm going to write the novel anyway and see what happens. And so it was really visually planted in my head before it was like a narrative structure. And the novel is really, really different. I'm trying to translate it at the moment, actually, and I'm constantly surprised by how different it is. It's kind of a dystopian novel. It's set in 2020 in the future, where we are now. It's quite nightmarish, but instead of a coronavirus, there are just no books anymore. Okay. So no real books exist. And And it's more to do with Ibn discovering the sort of conspiracy of the government, that they're ridding the country of books and getting rid of the nation's history and memory. And it's very kind of quirky because, you know, the twins don't just take Ibn hostage, they take like all the day visitors of the library hostage, which in a psychological reality in a film you'd never get away with, because you'd be like, where's the security? There's a camera there, there are security guards there. Conveniently in the book, you know, the security guards have all gone off to Cardiff for a nice little brunch at the assembly, to show off about their new security measures. So it's kind of like a bit of a farce as well, the novel. And when it came to sort of sitting down with Eros and working out how we're going to tell this story on film in 90 minutes, he kept stressing that, you know, you've got to choose one viewpoint. And I was like, well, it's a multiple narrative. It's all of their viewpoints. And he was like, no, just one. And I was like, but they're twins. Two, can we have two viewpoints? So it's a really, really tricky process of condensing it down to what it is. And also, you know, changing it into psychological thriller from a dystopia novel. You know, I went through so many drafts, and I'm pleased with what we came up with in the end. And I think it works for that particular medium, because it needed to be direct, it needs to be stripped down. And the characters, I think, have remained more or less intact. Dan is probably the character that's remained most intact, really, from the book. Whereas all the other characters have had to change a little bit just to fit their new psychological reality, really.
Can I ask you, what did you feel any responsibility while making a Welsh film? Did you feel any responsibility there?
I always feel a responsibility making a kind of Welsh production, that it represents Wales in an interesting way. You know, I don't want to portray us to the outside world as kind of, you know, melancholy, kind of trapped in rural communities without a future, and that sort of portrayal of Wales makes me feel like that's what the outside world is comfortable with knowing about Wales, and they don't want that challenge very much. So I'm deliberately kind of, you know, going against that, because I think Wales has got so much more to offer, and humour is really important, and it's not, you know, it doesn't always have to be like the Gavin and Stacey type humour about Wales. We're quirkier and more surreal, and we've got our own, you know, in a Fflur, there's one scene where the other porter, played by Cadwyn Glynn, is looking at like really old, like 70s sort of porn from Wales, which is a satirical mag called LOL, which did actually feature naked women on the cover, and it's so retro and weird, and I just, that gave me a little chuckle to think what people outside of the Welsh culture would even think he was looking at. They just look so weird. But yeah, it's the surreal and the absurd and the quirkiness, and I think that's what I'm useful for, maybe, to portray. You know, I don't think everybody's got their own own way of representing Wales, but I certainly think that we've been stuck in a certain stereotype for so long that I just don't want to ever play into those tropes, I guess.
I'm not, until recently, I've never been the biggest TV watcher. So I kind of started when we watched 35 Hours last year, and started watching TV a bit more. And it's something that I spoke to Philip John about last week, is that I'm frustrated also with that. And I think at times I've been turned off Welsh productions. And I even still am now. There's even films that I own that I haven't yet watched that are set in Wales, because I do tire of farms after a while. And like, you know, even Hedd Wyn, which is one of our most famous films nominated for an Oscar, I even struggled to watch that recently because I've just seen enough Welsh farms to last a lifetime, you know? And I know there are loads of farms in Wales, but what you're saying, I obviously agree with. We need to project a bigger range of Welsh life than farms and these areas. And do you think that not maybe in terms of Fflur, but do you think that the bilingualism, I mean, how do you think bilingualism can project a different image and bring in a different audience to not just S4C, but just Welsh drama as a whole? Because I'm now watching primarily Welsh dramas such as yours and Bang, which is very bilingual, of course. But I'm watching them on S4C, and even 5 years ago, I wouldn't have done that. So, how do you feel that bilingualism and just different images of Wales can bring non-Welsh speakers or very basic Welsh learners into Welsh drama?
I think it can do so by appearing very current, and that's something I think, you know, Chidi Pimpawr, Chidi Pimp Diwrnod do. I think Bang does. It appears kind of current, and it's a narrative that kind of moves quickly and draws you in. I think it was interesting in Bang because the Welsh language in some places it uses a kind of like almost like a plot device, and I think language as plot is something that we can play with. That I'm thinking of doing for another project that I'm working on. But I think there was a line where the killer, I won't give any spoilers, people haven't seen all of it, but the killer did come out with one line in Welsh. You noticed that when he hadn't before, and then Catherine Stewart goes, like, she gives him a bit of a look. I don't think it was ever picked up on, it was quite subtle, but like him suddenly speaking Welsh gave a little clue as to his background, which led to then them discovering that he was actually the killer. I thought that was really clever, you know. I think that we can use language as plot, and that's in Chidi Pimpawr, you know, Taz and Moira, there's a little scene of them in a room together where he's just making fun of her North Walian accent, the fact that she says techiall and she says, well, you say kettle, I'm sure. And it's just like the banter. I think it's showing Welsh audiences as well, and people who are learning Welsh or even non-Welsh speakers, that bilingualism is something that we're really, really comfortable with. And it's not unduly, you know, I'm also aware that I don't want to make a kind of, I don't want to use too much English either in my dramas, because it's a Welsh language channel, but it's like the little flourishes, the way that, you know, it is code switching, which is what we do and what we've been influenced by in watching lots of TV and reading books in two different languages, that we effortlessly switch, or we use a English word rather than a Welsh word. You know, the English can also be used as comedy when you're speaking Welsh. You know, me and my husband have this thing, sometimes we speak English to each other if we're being ironic, which you try to explain it to an English speaker, they don't understand that, but it's just like a passing thing, because we would never speak English to each other, so it's obviously like a joke. So I think it's finding, personally, I find that if you can find humour in bilingualism, it's sort of, it's a way of bringing people in, I think, and showing them, especially learners, you know, it doesn't matter if you've got flaws in your Welsh, you know, you can speak it any way you want, and, you know, English speakers are not flawless, you know, it's, language is interesting, and it's fluid, and it keeps changing and adapting, and
there was a line in
hopefully a positive thing we can show in drama.
In Chidi Pimpawr, there was a line where Rebecca Hayes' character, what was her name? Rebecca Hayes.
Rhee, she's called Rhee in the, yeah.
When Rhee says to James, the guy who nearly snuffs it at the beginning, they're in the room, they're in the jury room, and he says a big word in Welsh, and she looks to him and says, why have you got to speak like a bloody dictionary all the time? Just say, you know, the English word. And it's little moments like that which acknowledge the certain cultural elements of people who use very Welsh words for everything, where a lot of Welsh speakers will just use the English word because it's quicker, less syllables or whatever. And I mean, just bits of writing like that really helped to keep me in, because I kind of thought of it as a time as almost like just a simplifying of the language. You're dragging the monoglots into your drama with that sort of stuff. When you're writing, you're writing novels, music, but particularly novels and TV. You've referenced the difference between writing bilingually for the screen and writing novels is much harder. You're also a mum. Of how many children do you have?
I've got 2 daughters, age 7 and 9.
So I'll talk about myself briefly and indulge myself, because I'm a typical bloke, stereotypical, right? In that I'm slightly autistic and a bit of ADD. And one of the ways that manifests is a multitasking. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about stereotypes, but multitasking is, and particularly different modes, is something I struggle with a lot. So how do you how do you do it all? How do you how do you, as a person, as a creator, when I'm thinking about doing this, I want to smoke a cigarette, and I haven't had one for 12 years. That's how stressed the concept of it makes me. So how do you find the experience of being a creator of multiple genres and art forms, and also like having a family and getting paid? And how do you emotionally...
Well, the thing is, all those things that you've listed that I do, I have done them in different kind of stages of my life. So most of the novel writing, to be honest, happened before I was a mum. So, and it used to be that, I was working at Swansea University for around a decade, and then, you get lots of writing breaks, so it doesn't always work out like that, but you get the summer where you can do your research, and if you're a creative writing lecturer, you get to write a novel. And so I was quite focused about those things, and then I was doing the music at the same time, which was a complete release from my academic work, from my intense solitary novelistic kind of focus. Working with musicians was just wonderful, because musicians are so uncomplicated. I love them. It's just like, where do you want me? Plug in, play, and so my husband's a musician, and that's how we met. We were in a band together, and we're a group of friends all playing music, and so that sort of formed quite organically, I think. And that was kind of like a hobby, but which it turned into something more professional, because we made albums, but I'm not sure if we would have made albums if we weren't part of a Welsh language music scene, because it was very vibrant at the time, and you got opportunities to make music and to make pop videos and be on programs, and all that was kind of all that sort of came quite easily together, even though it was a really, really, really busy lifestyle. But
this is
then
mid-noughties you're looking at, right? Early to mid-noughties.
Sorry?
Early to mid-noughties you're talking about now?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's something like that. I think, well, I had my first child in 2010, which is when most of the music kind of stopped for a little bit. And I haven't done as much since. I managed to make one more album before I had my second daughter. And then the second one came along, and it was crazy, crazy, crazy time. Anyway, with two small kids, like at the age of 3, will tell you it's just like just doing anything, just going to the toilet, just it's a triumph. So,
yeah, my hair was black before, like mine. It was.
So there was that period, and then I think when I had the kids at home, this is how I came back into screenwriting in a way. So I'd given up on screenwriting a really long time ago. I'd taken a lot of interest in it was when I was at university in Aberystwyth. I'd done a couple of film modules with John Hevin, who directed Grand Slam and The Life and Times of David Lloyd George, and was a really iconic sort of figure in television in Wales. And he'd introduced me to all these sort of European films I'd never heard of, and I became obsessed with Krzysztof Kieslowski and the Three Colours trilogy. I tried to write my own Three Colours trilogy, red, white and green. Didn't quite work out, but and I started trying to make short films. I made one short film which was nominated for a DM Davies Award, and I made it with the Welsh College of Music and Drama. Used to sort of put new writers together with their actors, and that went sort of early 2000. And then I also made a short film with Euros Lynn in about 2002, 2003, which is how I met him. So I stumbled into a film workshop with him when I was doing my PhD in Bangor University, and sort of we made a short film together about a frustrated woman working in a photography shop, and that turned out really, really well. And I thought, oh, he's brilliant. And of course, then he went on to do Doctor Who and Torchwood and everything else that he did. So I'd had a few like little script commissions from SFC, but they'd not come to anything. I think at some point you just sort of give up, because it's sort of hard to keep going when nothing is happening there. And so then I'd start writing prose, and I went to teach. But then, okay, so then fast forward another 10 years and I've had my second child, and I'm sort of sitting at home and not sleeping. And I get this sort of call out from Boom Productions, who are looking for new ideas. And whenever I got an email like that when I was at work at the university, I would just sort of either say, no, I'm really sorry, or I just sort of ignore it, because I had a job, and I didn't want to get distracted with something that maybe wouldn't come to anything. But during that time when I had a little baby, it was a distraction to go to meetings. I started pitching this story about a female vicar who's married, who's obsessed with an undertaker. My husband is also an undertaker. It was kind of like our life at the time. Musician turned undertaker, still a musician. But anyway, sorry, that's a whole other podcast, basically. Anyway, I was pitching this thing, and I was writing up a treatment in the middle of the night when the baby was like, waiting to be fed. And surprisingly, within about 6 months, it had been commissioned, and I was like, oh my God, I've got to write 8 episodes of a TV drama, and I've never done that before. And then, the rest is history, I think, really. Fell back in love with screenwriting. The thrill of kind of seeing it be produced and getting the reaction, and the film Fflur was actually being developed at the same time. So, Parch came out, and then Fflur came out straight afterwards. And it looked like, everything was happening at once, but that had been a sort of a steady build-up of 6 years for the film, and maybe about 10 to 15 years of trying and failing to become a screenwriter. So I think I do believe that everybody gets the kind of like one moment where there's a little gap there, and you just kind of go for it, and if it works, then sets you off on a different path, I think. So since then, screenwriting's been the main thing. Yeah.
In terms of the future, what you got going on? You've probably got about 14 projects spinning around in different art forms and genres. I want to see. I was saying to Philip John last week, like genre stuff. I want, as a fan, a consumer, I want to see Welsh genre in bilingual and Welsh language genre film and TV. I mean, I'd love to see some Welsh dystopia proper, and I'd love to see some Welsh sci-fi. Wouldn't that be just?
Well, funny that you mention that. I've been working on a theatre show, because I was meant to put on a show at the Eisteddfod this year, but obviously it's been cancelled. It's called Fflur, which is the old Welsh word for moonlight, and it's about a woman in 2050 who is working on the moon, and her relationship with her family who live in Tregaron, and the coming back and forth. And so I've been doing just loads and loads of research on the moon, and just been kind of space obsessed recently. So it would be great to turn that into a kind of a different kind of project as well. But I've got to finish the theatre show first. But also coinciding with that, I have been writing a book, which is a non-fiction sort of memoir of my time growing up in Ceredigion, but seen through the 8 phases of the moon. So it's a bit of science and a bit of personal history as well. So those 2 projects were meant to all come to a head in August, but now they've come to a stop. So I'm just taking a bit of time thinking about how I want to do those. But I'm writing a series called Amgueddfa, The Museum for SLC, which is a thriller in a museum. Does this sound familiar at all? It's about a woman running the National Museum of Cardiff, and about an affair that she starts with a young man who works in a charity shop. But you find out that it's more than an affair. There's a kind of conspiracy there as well. So it's like a thriller with lots of Welsh kind of artifacts thrown in.
Plenty of symbolism there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the main thing at the moment, developing a few other TV projects, and I don't know what will happen to anything, because nothing can go into production at the moment, and it's difficult to know, what the future holds. And if production, halts for the next series, then maybe I will take some time to write some more fiction, prose fiction. which is what I've been trying to get back into for years, I suppose.
It's the not knowing which kills me. If someone said this is going to go on for 2 years, I'd be, yeah, okay, 2 years, gutted. But it's the not knowing which messes with my brain.
Yeah.
It's a weird one. What are you watching, or what are you looking forward to in terms of anything, any Welsh dramas, films, TV?
I'm looking forward to Gwlydd, Lee Haven-Jones and Roger Williams's feature film, which is part of the cinematic package that we did with the Llyfrgell.
Yeah.
I'm also looking forward to seeing Eternal Beauty, the Craig Roberts film. Yeah, just looking forward to anything that is just kind of quirky and different, and not your usual story about Wales. Otherwise I'm just watching like kind of Norwegian and Danish dramas at the moment. I've started watching Ride Upon the Storm, the Danish drama, which is a bit like Parch, but it's more sophisticated and they've got more money. It's really great, actually. I watched Twin, the Norwegian one. I'm not sure about the ending. What else am I watching? Watching Normal People. I didn't think it could be as good as the book, but it is brilliant. What else have I been watching? Yeah, just lots of. I'm just trying to find silly and entertaining things as well, because I think we all need it at the moment.
Too right. Oh well, Fflur. So we'll say ta-ra. So everybody, Sunday night, 9 p.m. S4C. iPlayer or
9 p.m. Yes, and it's repeated if you want to watch it in real time on telly. I think it's repeated this Friday night with on-screen subtitles at 11 p.m.
Okay, so Fflur Dafydd, diolch yn fawr. Thanks very much for chatting.
Diolch.